The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Buckingham Palace as Queen Elizabeth II prepared for what would become one of her most talked-about appearances. It was 2012, and the London Olympics were approaching. Danny Boyle, the creative director, had approached her with an unusual request that would make royal history. Elizabeth sat in her private study, reading through the proposal with her signature composed expression. The idea was audacious. The Queen of England would appear in a short film with James Bond, played by Daniel Craig. Most monarchs would have politely declined such a theatrical venture, but Elizabeth had always possessed a mischievous streak that delighted those who knew her well. Her private secretary shifted nervously as she reviewed the script. The plan involved Daniel Craig arriving at the palace, escorting her through the corridors, and then both of them appearing to parachute into the Olympic Stadium. The Queen looked up from the papers, her eyes twinkling with an impish gleam that her family knew all too well. "So, Mr. Bond will be collecting me, will he?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of dry amusement that had become her trademark. The secretary nodded, still uncertain about her reaction. Without missing a beat, Elizabeth added, "I do hope he's punctual. I hate to be kept waiting, even by secret agents." The filming day arrived, and the palace staff watched in amazement as their usually formal queen transformed into something of a performer. She delivered her single line, "Good evening, Mr. Bond," with such perfect timing and subtle humor that even the seasoned film crew applauded. But it was her improvisations between takes that truly showed her wit. When Daniel Craig stumbled slightly over a Persian rug during one take, Elizabeth quipped, "Perhaps we should have Q provide you with better shoes, Mr. Bond." The actor, initially intimidated by working with actual royalty, found himself laughing genuinely at her unexpected humor. She had a gift for putting people at ease while maintaining her dignity. During the lunch break, Elizabeth surprised everyone by asking detailed questions about the filmmaking process. She was particularly intrigued by the special effects that would make it appear as though she and Bond were parachuting together. "So the audience will believe I've jumped from a helicopter?" she asked with mock seriousness. "I do hope they don't. Expect me to make this a regular occurrence." The palace corgis made an unscheduled appearance during filming, trotting into the shot as if they too wanted to be part of cinematic history. Instead of being flustered, Elizabeth incorporated them seamlessly into the moment. "Even my dogs want to meet James Bond," she observed with a smile that reached her eyes. What struck everyone present was how the Queen balanced her royal dignity with a surprisingly playful spirit. She understood the importance of the moment. The Olympics would showcase Britain to the world, but she also seemed to genuinely enjoy the theatrical absurdity of it all. Her willingness to participate in such an unconventional project revealed a monarch who understood that sometimes the most effective way to serve was to show her human side. The film's premiere at the Olympics opening ceremony was met with thunderous applause and global delight. Audiences around the world were charmed by their queen's unexpected cameo, but those who worked with her that day knew they had witnessed something deeper, a leader who could embrace joy and humor while never abandoning the grace that defined her reign. Years later, palace staff would still smile when recounting that day. Elizabeth had shown them, and the world, that being regal didn't mean being rigid, and that sometimes the most queenly thing to do was to surprise everyone with a perfectly timed joke and an willingness to play along with life's more delightful absurdities. The kitchen at Balmoral Castle bustled with unusual activity on a crisp Scottish morning in 1998. Queen Elizabeth II had surprised her staff by announcing she would personally prepare tea for a visiting dignitary. Not just any dignitary, but a young Tony Blair, who had recently become Prime Minister. Mrs. McDougall, the head cook, watched nervously as Her Majesty rolled up her sleeves and approached the kitchen counter with the determination of someone embarking on a grand adventure. Elizabeth had always been more hands-on than many realized, but cooking for a prime minister was unprecedented territory, even for her. "I believe Mr. Blair mentioned he enjoys a proper Scottish breakfast," Elizabeth announced to the kitchen staff, who were trying their best to look supportive while privately panicking. She began examining the ingredients with the same careful attention she gave to state papers. lifting each egg as if assessing its potential for diplomatic success. The Queen's approach to cooking revealed her methodical nature and surprising practicality. She had grown up during rationing and had never lost her appreciation for simple, well-prepared food. As she cracked eggs into a bowl, she remarked to Mrs. McDougall, "During the war, we had to make do with dried eggs. These fresh ones from our own hens seem almost luxurious by comparison." Tony Blair arrived earlier than expected, and instead of being ushered into a formal dining room, he was led directly to the kitchen where he found the Queen of England standing over a sizzling pan wearing an apron that read Chief Cook and Bottle Washer, a cheeky gift from Prince Philip. The Prime Minister's expression was priceless, a mixture of confusion, delight, and the dawning realization that he was witnessing something extraordinary. "Your Majesty," he stammered, "you really didn't need to." "Nonsense," Elizabeth replied without looking up from the stove, expertly flipping what would later be described as the most famous scrambled eggs in British political history. "A proper conversation requires proper food, and I've been told I make an adequate breakfast." As they sat at the simple wooden kitchen table, Blair later recounted, the atmosphere was unlike any other meeting he'd had with the monarch. Elizabeth served the meal herself, pouring tea from a well-worn pot that had clearly seen countless family breakfasts. The informality of the setting seemed to unlock a different side of both of them. "You know, Mr. Blair," Elizabeth said as she buttered her toast with the precise movements of someone who had done this thousands of times, "I find that people are more honest when they're eating something homemade. There's something about shared food that cuts through all the ceremony." The conversation that followed was remarkably candid. Away from the formal settings of Buckingham Palace, Elizabeth proved to be an astute political observer with a wicked sense of humor about the complexities of governance. When Blair mentioned the challenges of dealing with difficult MPs, she chuckled and said, "Try managing a family dinner with 4 children who all have strong opinions about everything. Parliament might actually be easier." What impressed Blair most was how naturally Elizabeth inhabited this domestic role, while never diminishing her authority. She was simultaneously the Queen and a woman who knew her way around a kitchen, someone who could discuss matters of state while ensuring his teacup never went empty. The breakfast lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than any scheduled meeting. As Blair prepared to leave, Elizabeth wrapped the remaining scones in a tea towel and pressed them into his hands. "For Cherie and the children," she said with a conspiratorial smile, "though you needn't mention who made them if you think it might cause a fuss." Years later, Blair would describe this breakfast as one of his most memorable encounters with the Queen. It wasn't just her unexpected culinary skills that impressed him, but her understanding that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most ordinary settings over the simplest meals, prepared with genuine care and served with a hefty portion of royal wit. The drawing room at Buckingham Palace had been transformed into a film set, though visitors might not have immediately noticed the cameras tucked discreetly behind ornate furniture. It was early 2022, and Queen Elizabeth II was preparing for what would become one of her most beloved public appearances, tea with Paddington Bear for her Platinum Jubilee celebrations. At 96, Elizabeth had mastered the art of surprising people, but even her closest advisors were curious about how she would handle sharing screen time with a marmalade-loving bear. The creative team had written a charming script, but those who knew the Queen well suspected she might have her own ideas about how the scene should unfold. Paddington, brought to life through careful animation, was to be her tea guest. The premise was delightfully simple. A polite bear visits the Queen for afternoon tea and chaos inevitably ensues. But as the cameras began rolling, Elizabeth proved once again that her timing and instincts were impeccable. When Paddington accidentally squirted cream across the room during their tea, Elizabeth's reaction was pitch perfect. She didn't flinch or break character. Instead, she simply dabbed at an imaginary spot on her dress with the resigned patience of someone who had spent decades dealing with unpredictable situations. Her expression suggested this was hardly the strangest thing that had happened during a palace tea service. The magic happened during their conversation about sandwiches. Paddington confessed his love of marmalade sandwiches, and Elizabeth listened with the same attentive interest she had shown to countless world leaders. When he offered her a sandwich from under his hat, she politely declined, but then delivered the line that would capture hearts around the world. "I keep mine in here," she said, opening her famous black handbag to reveal her own marmalade sandwich. The gesture was so unexpected, so perfectly Elizabeth, that even the film crew paused in amazement. Here was the Queen of England, admitting to carrying emergency sandwiches in her handbag with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss state affairs. What made the moment extraordinary wasn't just the revelation itself, but how naturally Elizabeth delivered it. There was no sense that she was performing or trying to be amusing. She spoke as if keeping marmalade sandwiches in one's handbag was the most sensible thing in the world. Her delivery suggested that perhaps everyone should be so prepared. During breaks in filming, Elizabeth engaged the crew in conversations about the technical aspects of bringing Paddington to life. She was genuinely curious about the animation process and asked thoughtful questions about how the bear's movements were created. "It's quite remarkable," she observed, "how real he seems. I almost want to offer him a proper cup rather than an imaginary one." The scene where Paddington tapped his teacup with his spoon to the rhythm of "We Will Rock You" presented a delightful challenge. Elizabeth had to appear to react to music that would be added later, trusting that the final product would make sense. Her solution was characteristically practical. She simply imagined Prince Philip tapping along to music in the car, something he had done countless times during their long marriage. When Paddington stood for the Queen and doffed his hat, Elizabeth's warm smile was genuinely touched. The gesture of respect from this beloved fictional character seemed to move her, and her response, "Thank you, Mr. Brown," carried the same gracious acknowledgement she had given to millions of real subjects over 7 decades. The film wrapped, with Paddington and the Queen tapping their teacups together, creating the rhythm that would soon echo through a Jubilee concert attended by thousands. As the cameras stopped rolling, Elizabeth remained seated for a moment, still smiling. "I do hope the real Paddington would approve," she said to no one in particular, as if the bear himself might wander in to offer his opinion. The finished film became an instant classic, shared millions of times and treasured by families worldwide. But for those present during filming, the most memorable aspect wasn't the polished final product. It was watching Elizabeth embrace the joy of the moment, with such natural grace that she made having tea with an animated bear seem like the most normal thing in the world. Windsor Castle's perfectly manicured gardens became the setting for an unscheduled adventure on a bright spring morning in 2001. Queen Elizabeth II had just finished her daily walk with her beloved corgis when a gardener accidentally left the main gate open. What followed would become legendary among palace staff as the Great Corgi Escape. Her Majesty was reviewing some papers on a garden bench when she noticed an unusual silence. The familiar sound of multiple small paws pattering around her feet had ceased entirely. She looked up from her documents to find the garden completely empty of dogs. 4 royal corgis had seized their moment of freedom and vanished into the streets of Windsor. Most people might have panicked or immediately summoned help, but Elizabeth responded with characteristic practicality mixed with barely concealed amusement. She folded her papers, placed them carefully in her bag, and announced to her startled protection officer, "Well, I suppose we'd better go and collect them before they start their own royal walkabout." The search party was unlike any Windsor had ever seen. The Queen of England, accompanied by 2 bemused security officers and an increasingly frantic equerry, walked through the streets calling for her dogs by name. "Monty, Emma, come along now," she called with the same firm but affectionate tone she used during their palace walks. The first corgi was discovered outside a local bakery, having apparently decided that freedom smelled like fresh bread. Elizabeth approached the shop owner, who was staring in disbelief at the royal dog pressed against his window. "I believe this little fellow belongs to me," she said pleasantly, as if retrieving escaped dogs from bakeries was part of her regular, royal duties. The baker, still processing the surreal nature of the situation, stammered an apology for not recognizing the royal pet. Elizabeth's response became the talk of the town. "No need to apologize. He has excellent taste. "Your shop smells wonderful. I might have stopped here myself if I weren't on a rescue mission." The second and third corgis had discovered Windsor's small park, where they were enthusiastically making friends with local children and their parents. The sight of the Queen approaching the playground caused a moment of stunned silence, followed by excited whispers and hastily straightened postures from the adults. Elizabeth handled the situation with her trademark blend of dignity and humor. She thanked the children for keeping her dogs company, and listened patiently as several young ones excitedly reported on her pet's playground adventures. "Holly tried to go down the slide," one 6-year-old announced importantly, "but she's too short." "Yes, she's always been ambitious beyond her size," Elizabeth replied seriously, as if discussing matters of national importance. She produced treats from her handbag, because, as palace staff knew, she always carried dog biscuits, and called her wayward pets to attention. The fourth corgi, Willow, had managed to travel the farthest and was discovered in the garden of a nearby cottage, engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with a tabby cat. The elderly homeowner, Mrs. Peterson, had been too shocked to do anything but offer the royal dog a bowl of water. When Elizabeth knocked on Mrs. Peterson's door, the poor woman nearly fainted. "Your Majesty, the dog just appeared. I didn't know," she stuttered. Elizabeth, noticing the woman's genuine distress, immediately put her at ease. "How kind of you to look after Willow. I hope she's been behaving herself." Elizabeth glanced at her corgi, who was still eyeing the cat with interest. "Though knowing her, she's probably been interrogating your cat about the best spots for sunbathing." Mrs. Peterson, emboldened by the Queen's warm manner, admitted that the dog had indeed claimed the sunniest spot in her garden. Elizabeth laughed, a genuine delighted sound. "That's Willow. She has an excellent sense of comfort. You must have a lovely garden for her to approve so quickly." The walk back to the castle became an impromptu meet and greet, as word spread about the Queen's unusual morning adventure. Elizabeth greeted everyone with her customary graciousness, seemingly unperturbed by the informal circumstances. When someone apologized for the casual encounter, she replied, "Nonsense. Some of my most pleasant conversations happen during the most unexpected moments." Back at Windsor Castle, Elizabeth recounted the morning's events to her staff with evident enjoyment. She seemed particularly amused by her dog's individual choices: the bakery, the playground, and the cottage garden. They each found exactly what appealed to them most, she observed. Perhaps they know something about spontaneous adventures that the rest of us have forgotten. The incident became a favorite story among Windsor locals and palace staff alike. It perfectly captured Elizabeth's ability to handle unexpected situations with grace while revealing her fundamental humanity. Here was a woman who could command worldwide respect and authority, yet spent her morning cheerfully retrieving escaped pets and charming shop owners with the same natural ease she brought to state occasions. The balcony of Buckingham Palace had witnessed countless historic moments, but nothing quite prepared the world for what unfolded during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June 2022. Queen Elizabeth II, at 96 years old and dealing with mobility issues that had kept her from many public events, was determined to acknowledge the thousands who had gathered to celebrate her 70 years of service. Palace staff had been uncertain about whether she would be able to make the traditional balcony appearance. Elizabeth had been experiencing what she diplomatically called episodic mobility problems, and her participation in Jubilee events had been carefully managed day by day. But as the crowds gathered in the mall, their chants of affection growing louder, something stirred in the Queen that those who knew her well recognized immediately. Lady Susan Hussey, her longtime lady-in-waiting, was with Elizabeth in her private apartments as the sounds of celebration drifted through the palace windows. The Queen sat in her favorite chair, listening to the crowds with an expression that mixed weariness with determination. The weight of 7 decades of duty seemed to rest on her shoulders, yet there was something else in her eyes, a spark of the same spirit that had sustained her through World War II, countless tours and decades of change. "They sound happy," Elizabeth observed quietly, her voice carrying that particular tone of understatement she used when deeply moved. Lady Susan nodded, knowing that beneath the Queen's composed exterior was a woman genuinely touched by the outpouring of affection from her people. The decision to appear came suddenly, as many of Elizabeth's best decisions did. She looked up at Lady Susan and said simply, "I think I should like to go out and see them." There was no grand announcement, no lengthy preparation, just a queen who wanted to acknowledge the love being offered so freely outside her window. Their journey to the balcony required careful planning. Palace staff quickly coordinated with her doctors and mobility aids, but Elizabeth was focused on something else entirely. She spent precious minutes ensuring her outfit was perfect, not out of vanity, but from a deep understanding that this might be one of her last great public moments. When the balcony doors opened and Elizabeth appeared, supported but standing proudly, the roar from the crowd was unlike anything heard before. 50,000 voices united in celebration, and for a moment the sound seemed to physically lift the small figure on the balcony. Elizabeth's smile in that instant was radiant, not the practiced royal smile of duty, but something genuine and deeply moved. What happened next became the moment that defined not just the Jubilee, but perhaps Elizabeth's entire relationship with her people. As she waved to the crowd, a chant began to build. "Thank you, ma'am, thank you, ma'am." The simple words carried the weight of gratitude for 7 decades of unwavering service. Elizabeth's reaction was extraordinary. For a brief moment, her composure, maintained through thousands of public appearances, seemed to waver. Her eyes brightened with unshed tears, and she placed her hand over her heart in a gesture so spontaneous and human that it seemed to reach every person in that vast crowd. But it was what she did next that truly captured hearts worldwide. Instead of simply acknowledging the thanks with her usual gracious wave, Elizabeth began to mouth the words, "Thank you," back to the crowd. She was thanking them for thanking her, creating a moment of mutual appreciation that transcended the usual formalities of royal occasions. Prince William, standing beside her, later described being moved by his grandmother's visible emotion. "She spent her whole life serving others," he would say, but in that moment she seemed surprised and genuinely touched that people wanted to thank her for it. It was beautiful to see her receive back some of the love she'd given so freely. The crowd seemed to sense the significance of the moment. Their cheers grew gentler, more reverent, as if they understood they were witnessing something precious and unrepeatable. Elizabeth remained on the balcony longer than planned, seeming reluctant to end this connection with people who had shared her journey through decades of change. As she finally prepared to retreat inside, Elizabeth raised both hands in a final wave that encompassed the entire mall. The gesture was encompassing, almost blessing-like, as if she were reaching out to embrace every person who had come to celebrate with her. The crowd fell into a respectful silence, understanding that they had just witnessed something sacred. Back inside the palace, Elizabeth was quiet for several minutes, still processing what had occurred. When Lady Susan asked how she felt, the Queen's response was characteristically understated but deeply felt. "Rather overwhelmed, actually. I hadn't expected—" Well, one doesn't expect such kindness. The balcony appearance lasted only a few minutes, but it became the defining image of the Platinum Jubilee. Photographs of Elizabeth's radiant, moved expression were shared around the world, capturing not just a monarch acknowledging her subjects, but a woman genuinely surprised and touched by an outpouring of love that matched her own lifelong devotion to service. For those who witnessed it, the moment represented everything wonderful about Elizabeth's reign: duty and warmth, formality, and genuine human connection, the weight of history, and the lightness of shared joy. It was, quite simply, perfect. Balmoral Castle in September 2022 held a peaceful quiet that seemed to embrace everything within its ancient stone walls. Queen Elizabeth II sat in her favorite sitting room, surrounded by the Scottish landscapes that had provided her with sanctuary and strength for decades. At 96, she had recently appointed her 15th Prime Minister, Liz Truss, in what would be her final official act as monarch. The meeting with the new Prime Minister had taken place just 2 days earlier, and photographs from that encounter would later be treasured as capturing Elizabeth in her element, still working, still engaged, still putting duty before everything else. Her hands showed her age, but her eyes remained sharp with the intelligence and interest that had characterized her entire reign. Lady Susan Hussey found her that afternoon reading correspondence, as she had done nearly every day for 70 years. Even here in her private retreat, Elizabeth maintained her connection to the Commonwealth and her people, but there was something different about her demeanor, a sense of completion, as if she had finished a very long and important task. "The Highland air is particularly lovely today," Elizabeth observed, looking out at the rolling hills that had witnessed generations of her family's summers. She had always found peace in Balmoral's timeless beauty, but today she seemed to be drinking in every detail with special attention. Her final days were spent much as her entire adult life had been, in service to others, even when those others didn't realize it. She dictated letters of congratulation to winners of various honors, approved final arrangements for upcoming engagements she wouldn't live to see, and ensured that every detail of royal business was properly concluded or transferred. The staff at Balmoral would later recall how Elizabeth maintained her gentle humor, even as her strength clearly waned. When her doctor suggested she rest more, she replied with a slight smile, "I've been practicing for my final rest for 96 years. I think I'll manage it quite well when the time comes." Her ability to find lightness even in life's most solemn moments never abandoned her. On her last evening, Elizabeth sat quietly in her private study, surrounded by photographs spanning 7 decades of public service. Images of her coronation, state visits, family moments, and countless encounters with ordinary people who had become extraordinary through their brief connection with her. Each photograph told a story of duty willingly embraced, of joy found in service, of a life lived entirely for others. She spent time looking at pictures of Philip, her companion for over 70 years, whose death the previous year had left a profound emptiness in her daily life. But rather than sadness, her expression held gratitude for their long partnership, for the privilege of their shared service, for a love that had sustained them both through decades of public duty. Her final written note, found later on her desk, was characteristically thoughtful and forward-looking. She had been working on arrangements for various charitable patronages, ensuring smooth transitions that would benefit the organizations long after her passing. Even facing the end of her remarkable life, Elizabeth was planning for others' futures. The next morning brought the Scottish sun streaming through the windows of Balmoral, illuminating a castle that had suddenly become much quieter. Queen Elizabeth II had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the countryside she loved, having given everything she had to a role she never sought but embraced completely. News of her death spread around the world within hours, but it was the stories that followed, from palace staff, former prime ministers, Commonwealth leaders, and ordinary people whose lives she had touched, that revealed the true measure of her legacy. These weren't tales of grand gestures or historic moments, but of small kindnesses, unexpected humor, and genuine interest in others that had characterized her approach to monarchy. A young page recalled how she always thanked him by name for even the smallest services. A gardener remembered her stopping to admire particularly beautiful flowers and asking about his family. A visiting head of state mentioned her ability to make everyone feel as if they were the most important person in the room. These accumulating moments of grace painted a portrait of a woman who understood that true leadership lay in countless small acts of consideration. Her final gift to the world was the example she had set, not through perfection, but through consistency, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to putting duty before personal desires. She had shown that service could be both burden and privilege, that duty could coexist with genuine warmth, and that a life lived for others was perhaps the most fulfilling life of all. The tributes that poured in from around the globe spoke not just of a monarch, but of someone who had managed to remain genuinely human while carrying the weight of an ancient institution. She had been witty without being unkind, dignified without being cold, and dedicated without being rigid. In an age of increasing cynicism about public service, she had remained a beacon of what was possible when duty and humanity worked in perfect harmony. Elizabeth's greatest achievement was not any single moment of her reign, but the accumulation of decades of small kindnesses, quiet service, and gentle humor that had touched millions of lives. She had proven that true greatness lay not in seeking attention, but in consistently doing what needed to be done with grace, humor, and unfailing consideration for others.